A warm welcome to this week's episode of Lost for Words. I am your host Jason, and for episode 36, I am joined by a Scottish political stalwart who hardly needs an introduction. Tommy Sheridan is a hardline socialist who has been on the front line of Scottish politics for more than 30 years. He speaks to me about his socialist beliefs, fighting the poll tax, spending time in prison, and being elected as a councillor from his prison cell. Being elected as an MSP to the first Scottish Parliament, as well as a deep dive into modern day issues like independence and the quote-unquote legacy of COP26 for Glasgow, including the workers' strikes that have been going on. I hope you enjoy listening. A quick housekeeping note before we get started. Please leave a rating or a review wherever you get your podcasts, whether that be Apple, Google, Spotify, Podbean, or any other platform. It's the best way the podcast can grow and better content can be produced for you, the listener. It's your listening experience that matters the most. But enough from me, now on to today's episode of Lost for Words. Firstly, I'd go back to the beginning then, Tommy. You're obviously a socialist, but how and when did you form your political beliefs?
I would suggest that my political beliefs began to be formed, or I became aware of them anyway, during modern studies classes at Lourdes Secondary School in the south side of Glasgow. I was born in Govan in Glasgow, moved to Pollock, one of the first big housing estates that was built after the Second World War in Glasgow. Moved there when I was 4 years of age, so effectively I was raised in Pollock. And by the time I've reached secondary school and we were doing things like special studies, I remember doing the Troubles in Northern Ireland and writing to Jerry Fitt, who was a SDLP MP at the time, and also John Hume, about things like internment and the occupation of Ireland. And I remember being aware that it was quite a controversial issue because obviously the 70s were full of some atrocities, and there's no doubt it was a thorny issue. But that sort of made me believe that I wanted to know more about politics. I then learned more about apartheid in South Africa, because the beauty of modern studies for me, Jason, was that it was a subject that I could relate to, because I wasn't, the truth is told, I wasn't a good student as such. I didn't read anywhere near as much as I should have done. It's the one thing that I've tried to get my daughter to do, but with very little success, I've got to say. I've tried to encourage her to read more, because when I was going through my school years, I can remember the English class, Mrs. Gohuli gave us Sunset Song, and here's the irony, Jason. I hated it. I absolutely hated it because I found it very difficult to read because of the language that was used in it. And of course, it was a socialist novel. I mean, written by a socialist about socialism that I didn't realise until very much later on in my years. But I absolutely hated reading and English. The only subject that I had any time for was modern studies. And that was because it was things that we talked about in the classroom that was then on the news at tea time, and things like apartheid. And then obviously through apartheid we learned about the American civil rights movement as well, and although it wasn't on the news, it was lots of parallels with what was going on with South Africa. So in those days I became certainly more politically aware, and when we've had a couple of Friends Reunited events a few years back, a number of my classmates, and I've got to say, I just don't remember this, a number of my classmates who were at that event were saying, "Oh, Tommy, we knew you were going to be a politician because you used to argue with the teachers about marking and getting time off and getting more time for essays, and I just can't remember any of that. But apparently, is what I was doing. So I was encouraged to stay on at school by my mother, Jason. I wanted to leave immediately after fourth year. As I say, I wasn't a great academic in any way, shape, or form. I wanted to get a job. I wanted to earn money. I wanted to play football. That was my ambition at that age. I wanted to be a footballer. However, my mum encouraged me to stay on and do hires. I got 5 O levels in those days, and I then did 4 hires, and I managed to get my 4 hires. I got 3 Bs and a C, and I still didn't really know what I was going to do with myself. And my mum had encouraged me to apply to university. And I used to say in those days, Mum, I don't want to go to university. I want to change the world. And my mum would say, listen, son, before you can change the world, you need to learn how it works. You'll never change it if you don't know how it works. And of course, I know now what she meant. And so I applied to Glasgow, applied to Strathclyde, applied to Stirling. And I was lucky to get accepted to all of the universities. But my mum, again, a big influence in my life, had suggested that why don't you go to Stirling? Because you would have to live in digs, and you would have to learn a wee bit more about life quite quickly. So I was only 17 when I went to Stirling University, and it was a bit of a shock because obviously I had been looked after very well by my mum during my upbringing, and the washings were always done and the food was always, and then you get thrown into a hall of residence and you've got a shared kitchen, and you have to do your own washing and you have to do your own cooking, and it was a bit of a culture shock to say the least. But I've got to say what happened then, Jason, was I had this sense, and I think a lot of working class youngsters have a similar sense. I had this sense of not belonging there. I felt as though I was an outsider. I felt as though I was an imposter at university, because when I went to some of not so much the lectures, because the lectures were so big that you didn't really get to know anybody. But when I went to tutorials with maybe 10 or 12 other students, they were all quite snobby and well spoken, and they seemed to know what they were all talking about. And I felt really, really out of place. In fact, I remember one particular sociology. I did sociology, politics, and economics in my first year. Those were the 3 subjects I did. And I remember a sociology tutorial, and it was on the causes and effects of unemployment. There was a book at the time by a guy called Kevin Hawkins that was the core book. And it was all about identity and what unemployment meant to you. That it wasn't just about a job, it was about losing your identity as well. And in the course of this tutorial, I was asked to comment on some of the passages in the book, and I had made the point that when you're signing on at the dole and people ask, what do? You tend to give your answer around the basis of your expertise or your trade, so that you say, oh, I'm a joiner, or I'm a brickie, or I'm an electrician, and that's your identity. And if you've not got an identity, then it can be really harmful for you mentally. So I thought this was a reasonable contribution, and I certainly felt it was in line with the book. And then there was 2 or 3 comments after me, and all they could ask was, what did I mean about the dole? What was the dole? And it suddenly struck me that these students, most of them from south of England, didn't have a clue what I was talking about when I was mentioning the dole. So that wee experience inspired me, Jason, to read and read and read again. I was determined not to fail at university, because I felt I'd been given this chance that nobody else in my family had been given up till then. I've got 2 older sisters, and neither of them got to go to university, so I was the first in the family. So I really dedicated myself to reading, and I read an awful lot of political books. began to study Karl Marx. I loved his writings. I felt as though it was like drawing curtains from a window to open out and let you see what the world was really like. So I became very, very engrossed in politics, get involved with the Labour Party, get involved with Militant, which was like a Marxist newspaper within the Labour Party. So from 17 onwards, I was certainly a political animal.
Was there did you have any specific idols, or was it more you were completely shaped by the entire ideology of socialism rather than any one individual?
One of them was a guy called John Maclean, who I had never heard about up until that age, 17 years of age. And then I was handed a book by Nan Milton, who turns out was John Maclean's daughter, and she'd written this book about John Maclean. And I'm reading about this guy who, during the First World War, had organised opposition to youngsters being sent to what effectively was one of the most futile conflicts the planet has ever known. Hundreds of thousands of young men being killed and crippled on the basis of absolutely nothing but markets and making people more profits. And this guy stood against it, even at a time when the whole of the country seemed to be patriotic and for the war. And in the course of arguing against the war and for workers' organisation and for better wages and conditions for the workers in the factories and the women in the factories, this guy ends up being arrested several times. He gets put into jail 4 times. He's charged with sedition. He's got the whole weight of the state against him. He ends up in 1918 getting sent to jail, but in Edinburgh High Court. He was my inspiration. And then to give me a sort of an articulation of my views in a modern sense was Tony Benn. Tony Benn in the late 70s, early 80s was a very powerful figure within the Labour Party, stood to be the deputy leader of the Labour Party. And if he hadn't been cheated with ballot rigging, then he would have been the deputy leader of the Labour Party. But his speeches and his campaigning, his deportment, his support for workers and struggle, I was just inspirational. So I was very much a Bennite and believed that this guy was worthy of support. And in many respects, although I joined, as I said earlier, the Militant, it was the likes of Ben that had attracted me to the Labour Party in the first instance. And he inspired me for many years in my life. I was so privileged, Jason, in later years to meet and spend time with Tony and get to consider him a friend. He was invited to my wedding in 2000, actually, and would have been there had his wife, Caroline, not been so ill. She later that year died of cancer, unfortunately. And one of the quirks of fate, and one of the reasons why Tony was keen to come to my wedding, was we were getting married on the 17th of June. And it turns out that was his and Caroline's wedding anniversary as well. So I became friends with Tony. He wrote to me when I was in prison several times, and I met him in his house, and we shared a lot of stories. And he was somebody that had inspired me throughout my life, and he's a massive, massive loss to the socialist movement.
Did you campaign in favour of devolution being reintroduced? And if so, what was your experience of doing that?
I think before we get to 99, Jason, it would be important to go through the struggle of 89, because the struggle of 89 was the anti-poll tax struggle. And the anti-poll tax struggle was vital, I think, in crystallising many people in Scotland's views of devolution and indeed independence. I have to say, hand on heart, in those days, I was still a British socialist. I still advocated for the road to British socialism that Tony Benn and others were advocating, because I felt that the Labour movement was strong enough, big enough, and united enough to deliver a socialist Britain. However, the poll tax campaign was a crystallising experience because, as you will know, Mrs. Thatcher, for her third term of office, decided that she wanted a kind of major project that would earmark her third term, and she decided that the community charge was going to be that she was going to get rid of the rating system, which was absolutely no problem for the majority of people. Didn't cause any problems other than for people with very big households, very big houses, and therefore had to pay property tax. So it wasn't a problem at all, but obviously the very rich property dwellers and property owners, they wanted it changed. And Thatcher came forward, along with Nicholas Ridley, with this idea of a community charge, which became known as the poll tax. But to rub salt in the wound, because we didn't vote for her in 79, because we didn't vote for her in 87, she decided, well, I'm going to give you something. I'm going to give you this poll tax, and I'm going to introduce it in Scotland first. So even though Scotland rejected her in 79, rejected her in 80, was it 82 or 83? I'm trying to remember when now, 83 I think it was, and then rejected her in 87. Then she punished us by saying, well, that's fine, I'm going to give you the poll tax first. So I'm going to remove this single property tax and I'm going to introduce a head tax. So I'm going to actually punish families with a large number of children who are over the age of 18. I'm going to make sure that the rich pay very much less than they currently pay, and the poor pay a lot more. So it was a wealth transfusion from the poor to the rich. It was a horrible, horrible piece of legislation, and we got it first. That, to me, brought home how England treated Scotland, how the Tories looked at Scotland, but how England as a whole looked at Scotland. I was involved in the Scottish anti-poll tax campaign. We built it from the late 80s, 88 through 89, when it was introduced, 31st of March of 89. And then I was involved in the All Britain Anti-Poll Tax Federation. I was elected the chairman of the All Britain Federation. So from 89 right through to 90, when it was introduced in England and Wales on the 31st of March 1990, I was all over the UK, speaking at rallies all over Wales, all over England, South England, Central England, North England, all over. And we built a fantastic campaign. We at the height of the movement in Scotland, with over 1 million non-payers. In England, we recorded 14 million non-payers. And although the poll tax was eventually repealed in Parliament when John Major got onto his feet and said that it had become uncollectible, what he didn't explain was that it was an anti-poll tax campaign that made it uncollectible. And that was a major, major victory for grassroots politics, for ordinary people. That then led the way for the removal of Thatcher, the introduction of Major. It was a weakened government, and although he won the 92 election, by the time it came in 97, the Tories were on their way out. And of course, we can't have history rewritten, because sometimes you listen to Blairites who tell you that Tony Blair was the one that won the 97 election, as if it was him and his politics that won that election. What they don't tell you is that John Smith was actually double points ahead in all the opinion polls before he died. And therefore, John Smith would have won the election as well, and he certainly wasn't a Blairite. So let's not allow history to be rewritten. However, 97 Blair election led to the Scotland Act a year later, as you know, in 98. The movement, the Scotland United movement, was very influential because it united a whole number of the political parties who argued for devolution. And there's no doubt in my mind, Jason, that many of the politicians involved, particularly from the Labour Party, Liberals, they saw the SNP as a threat politically. And they realised that if there wasn't more devolution, the SNP would grow in stature and grow in support, because the demand for greater control and greater say in Scotland was growing by the day. So the whole idea of devolution was, if you listen to your man, Tam Hill and others, George Robertson, I remember him saying that devolution would kill the SNP. How silly was George Robertson? So the Scotland United movement that led to the Scotland Act of 98 and then the Scottish Parliament being elected in 99 was very much a product of the politics beforehand. And I think the anti-poll tax campaign played a big role in that.
How would you summarise your time as an MSP?
I went in there as an underdog. Nobody had predicted that we would win a seat in 99. Everybody, all of the pollsters had said we didn't have a chance. So to win a seat in Glasgow was quite remarkable, given I had been in prison in 1992 for my part in preventing a poll tax warrant sale in Glasgow in 1991. And I'd been charged with contempt of court for interfering with the sheriff officers trying to execute this warrant sale against a single parent from Greenock in the west of Scotland. We managed to prevent the warrant sale. We managed to get the woman, she was a lone parent, we got our TV back, we got our display cabinet back, we got our coffee table back, and we stopped the warrant sale. But as part of the sort of a quid pro quo, the establishment decided they were going to have a go at me, and I get charged with contempt of court and incitement to riot. In the course of the trial at the High Court in Edinburgh, they dropped the incitement to riot part of the charge, but continued with the contempt of court, and I was found guilty and sentenced to 6 months in prison. However, in the May of 92, in fact, in April of 92, I stood for the general election of 92. I stood for the Glasgow Pollock seat, and I came second. I got 20% of the vote, which in those days was incredible. Jimmy Dunnicky, the Labour MP at the time, was very worried because we get such a large percentage of the vote. So in May, the month after that, I stood for the Glasgow City Council and was elected from my prison cell. I've went on to recognise since then that it was the easiest election campaign I ever fought because I didn't have to go and chap the doors and I didn't have to deliver the leaflets, but there was plenty of others outside that were doing that type of thing. And the people of Pollock elected me, which I was very, very proud of. I then get re-elected in 95 and re-elected in 99. So I was elected 3 times as a local councillor. So I must have been doing something right in those years. So by the time it came in 99, I'd already been active in grassroots politics. I'd already been representing people at a local level on the city council. So although I wasn't expected to win the seat in 1999, we did win it against the odds. And when I went to the Scottish Parliament, I was on my own. I was the only socialist elected. There was one Green member elected, but there was also, you remember, Dennis Canavan was elected as an independent as well. And we sort of became the troublesome 3. Robin Harper and Dennis Canavan and myself were sort of the individuals that made up the rainbow part of the Parliament, soon to be joined by Margot MacDonald, who fell out of favour with the SNP and became one of the troublesome squad as well. But when I went there, Jason, I had a lot of support outside the Parliament and had a lot of ideas. And one of the first things I wanted to do was use the Parliament properly. And I homed in on a piece of legislation which I was desperate to change. And it was warrant sales. Warrant sales are were a horrible piece of legislation. They were used in the Highland clearances by the establishment to frighten people and remove them from their homes. And effectively, it was a way of the powerful frightening the powerless. Because if you couldn't pay a debt, then what the authorities did is they took your possessions off you and sold your possessions to pay off the debt. And not only was it frightening, but it was embarrassing as well. These were used in the interwar years, and people used to see furniture piled up in streets outside homes, and they knew that somebody was being evicted and that their furniture was being sold. So I hated these warrant sales, and they tried to use them during the poll tax, and I was jailed for stopping one. So the first thing I wanted to do when I get to Parliament, I said, right, let's get rid of them. We're a modern Scotland. We've got a new Parliament. Let's scrap this ancient and barbaric practice of warrant sales. So I started a motion, a campaign. I laid a suggestion before the Parliament to change the law. I approached the parliamentary authorities at the time, and I said, listen, I want to introduce a bill. I want to introduce a law. Could you tell me where the bill writing chamber is in the office? Where do I go? And I was told by the Scottish Parliament Information and Research Centre, SPICE, I was told, oh, I'm awful sorry, we don't have such a thing. They have that in Westminster, a function, an office that actually writes bills for MPs, but they don't have it in Scotland. So I approached my friend at the Govan Law Centre, a guy called Mike Daly, who was a principal solicitor at the time, and I said, Mike, they don't have a bill writing facility. And he said to me, Tommy, I've never written a bill before, but how hard can it be? Let's go for it. So Mike Daly at Govan Law Centre wrote the warrant sales bill. He learned it overnight how to do it. We laid the bill. I approached John McCallion from the Labour Party, and I approached Alec Neil from the SNP, and I said, listen, I want this to be cross-party. This is about social justice. This isn't party politics. Would you co-sponsor it? And both of them were more than happy to do that. And there began the journey to get the first ever private members bill passed in the Scottish Parliament. We introduced it in '99, and it was passed, I think it was early 2001 or late 2000, but it was the first bill to be passed. It wasn't the first bill to be accepted. The first bill to be accepted was the Mike Watson bill to ban fox hunting, which was another bill that I supported. But I found myself embroiled in the idea of using the Parliament to get things done. I hated the pomp and the ceremony. I didn't attend the opening ceremony where the Queen came up. I couldn't understand why we had formed a new modern democratic Parliament and we still had an oath of allegiance to an outdated monarchy. It's just garbage. It was just pathetic, total and utter hypocrisy. In fact, Jason, the truth is 129 MSPs had to swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen before they were allowed to take their seat. I had a real wobble after the election because I was seriously considering resigning and not taking my seat. I just refused to swear an oath to a monarch that I've got absolutely no allegiance to. And I was told if you don't swear it within 3 months of being elected, then you have to stand down and your seat's re-elected. And I really thought, well, wait a wee minute, that's what I'm going to have to do. But a lot of the supporters and my family were saying, well, is that really the way you want to use the support that you've generated? You're going to miss an opportunity to get in there and be a voice for the poor and be a voice for the powerless. So with gritted teeth, I went into the ceremony and I raised my fist and I made a statement beforehand that I had no allegiance whatsoever to the monarch, but I was doing this under protest, and I then read the words that you had to read. But how ridiculous is it, Jason, that in a modern Scottish Parliament, the first thing you're asked to do as an MSP is lie. Because I know of the 129 MSPs, a minimum of half don't believe in the monarch, don't believe in the royal family or the crown, and yet they all had to swear an oath to it. So it's a ridiculous situation, absolutely ridiculous, and the sooner we get rid of it, the better. However, once I'd got the success of the warrant sales bill, and if you check Scottish Parliament history, you'll find that it's the first and probably the only time there's been a vote in the Scottish Parliament that nobody knew the result of beforehand. Because every vote in the Scottish Parliament is usually predicted because everybody's counted up the votes beforehand. But with this bill, there was a rebellion, a revolt within the Labour Party. In fact, to his eternal shame, people often forget these things when they talk about the esteemed Donald Dewar, the first minister. Donald Dewar had taken a heart attack during the passage of that bill to abolish warrant sales, but he climbed out of his sickbed to gather all of the Labour MSPs in the Friends Meeting House, the Quaker Meeting House, near to the temporary Parliament. We were in the church's building at the time, and he grabbed all of the Labour MPs to an emergency meeting during the lunch break before the afternoon debate to whip them into line and tell them that they had to vote it down. They had to vote to keep warrant sales. And there was a rebellion in the meet. Several of the Labour MSPs said no, they couldn't do it because it would be a hostage to fortune. How could they possibly hold their seats in working class areas by voting for warrant sales? I was told of the detail from a Labour MSP that was at the meeting that it caused utter mayhem. And of course, what happened was the meeting dragged on and dragged on and dragged on, so that some of them were still straggling into the debate in the chamber while the debate had started. And Jim Wallace, who was the Liberal leader, he was the Deputy First Minister, he was leading for the government that day. And he was reading from his script. His script was to argue against the bill. So after I had finished, he got up and told us all how necessary these barbaric warrant sales were and how we had to keep them. It was the only way to get the debts out of working class people, to scare the living daylights out of them. Made all sorts of excuses to keep this. And then all these bits of paper started getting passed around the chamber. And it was all this humming and hawing and whispering. And it became clear that they were going to lose the vote and that several Labour MSPs weren't going to vote for it. And if you check the record, you'll see that the Tories voted against it, and many of the Liberals voted against the bill, but most of the Labour squad abstained. And it meant that the SNP and the Independents were able to carry the day, and we were able to defeat the government. And as I say, it was the first and only defeat the government had in those years. I then went on very quickly, Jason, to introduce a second bill because I was very encouraged by the first one. And my second bill was to introduce free and healthy school meals for every child in Scotland. I felt it was a disgrace that we still had the stigma attached to free school meals, which was only there for the poor and was means tested. I felt it was a disgrace. So I campaigned for free and healthy school meals across Scotland. I used the example of Norway and other countries to argue for the health benefits and economic benefits. And we had a wonderful, wonderful campaign, wonderful with the STUC, with Unison, we had the EIS, Teachers Union. Everybody backed this. It was a fantastic campaign. Unfortunately, the Labour Party and the Liberals decided in their infinite wisdom that, oh no, it's too much money, we can't do it. Funny days now, isn't it? Because the Liberals and the Labour Party now support free school meals and attack the SNP for not introducing it. But there you go. In 2001, 2002, they didn't support them. And that bill was sadly defeated. However, most importantly of all, the seeds were laid And in later years, those seeds have developed, and people now support the principle of free and healthy school meals, which is important. And I'm glad that I played a role in that.
When you left in 2007, did you foresee any seeds being sown that would lead to an independence referendum coming?
Well, there was no doubt that support for the independence parties had begun to grow and become more significant. If you examine the 2003 election, the SSP, which I was the convener of at the time, went from one MSP to 6 MSPs on the back of an independent Socialist Scotland demand. The Green Party, that was a supporter of independence, went from one MSP to 7 MSPs. The SNP didn't necessarily have a good election, although they held on to most of the seats, but they didn't do as good as they were expected. Primarily, I think, down to John. Oh goodness, there you go. Such a legend in my household, and maybe in his own. I can't remember his second name. Swinney. John Swinney wasn't a very good leader. I relished that election. I relished the head-to-head debates I did with him on TV and elsewhere. He was more like a bloody bank manager than a political leader, because he certainly wasn't inspiring. And we took loads and loads of SNP independent supporting votes, and did very, very well. By the time we got to 2007, what became clear, and I take this as a backhanded compliment, but what became clear is the SNP started to steal the clothing that we had taken into the Parliament. The SNP, for instance, I introduced several other bills in my second term. I introduced a bill to get rid of the public sale of air weapons on the back of the horrific murder of the wee boy Cummings in Easterhouse, who was shot through the head with an air rifle. And I'd introduced a bill to license the sale of air weapons so that you couldn't just go into shops and buy them. Again, that was not back. They said we don't have the competence in the Parliament to get rid of air guns. We had the competence in the Parliament to legislate for how high hedges could be and for dog fouling in the street, but we couldn't legislate to get lethal weapons off our streets. So that really made me angry in terms of the limitations of the Scottish Parliament. I also introduced a bill, ironically enough, to take the railway services back into public ownership and to build a not-for-profit railway service instead of the stupid and wasteful service, the profit-led service that we had from the privatised rail service. And again, ironically, Jason, if you think about this, this bill to take the railways back into public ownership was voted down by the Labour Party, voted down by the SNP, and is now official policy of the Labour Party and is official policy of the SNP. But there you go, hey-ho. And then my third bill was to scrap the council tax and replace it with an income-related alternative to redistribute wealth across Scotland, so that we tax the wealthy more and tax the low-paid less. And we taxed our pensioners less. So we introduced a bill called the Scottish Service Tax to replace the council tax, and lo and behold, the SNP voted it down, and then in the 2000 election put in their manifesto to scrap the council tax. Marvellous that they stole the clothing, and we're now in 2021, 14 years later, and despite winning the election in 2007 on a commitment to scrap the council tax, they've still not done it. But there you go. If you check the record of the interview I did on the Friday night after the Thursday election in 2007, I did an interview with Bernard Ponsonby in Glasgow on the wee Squinty Bridge near to the STV studios, and he was interviewing me about losing my seat in 2007. We also it was a particularly hard election. It was a very, polarised election. We had the added complication of a political split within the socialist movement at the time. I'd fell out with people within the SSP. I'd formed a new party called Solidarity, and the SSP and Solidarity were fighting for largely the same vote. However, for anyone who says, "Oh, that's why you lost your seats," they're actually not paying attention to the reality of the situation, because the Greens lost 5 seats and returned only 2, but they didn't have any split in their party. So the problem in that election wasn't to do with splits in other parties. It was to do with the polarisation of the vote, and the fact that the SNP by that time had got their act together. Alex Salmond had come back to lead the SNP. They were a much more credible alternative to the Labour Party in Scotland, and therefore every single vote was very important, and people who were independent supporters weren't willing to give their second vote to ourselves in either Solidarity or the SSP, because they knew the SNP needed those votes. And what happened, as you know, is the SNP won its first minority government. They won the largest number of seats, so they were able to establish a minority government. In my interview with Bernard that night, I said, he asked me how I felt about losing my seat. And I said, well, personally, I'm disappointed. Of course I'm disappointed. I had lots of ideas and lots of campaigns that I wanted to take into the next parliament. However, from a political point of view, looking at the bigger picture, I was absolutely elated that the SNP had won a minority government, because the SNP stood against the Iraq war. The SNP stood for unilateral nuclear disarmament. The SNP stood for welcoming asylum seekers. The SNP stood for scrapping the council tax. So the SNP, by that time, by 2007, was a left of centre political party. And Scotland moved to the left, although, ironically enough, I was ditched. I lost my seat by 1%, which was a pity. But the Scotland moved to the left, and that is something that in the bigger scheme of things was important.
Were you always confident of a yes victory, or deep down did you suspect it was going to be an uphill battle?
I think at the start of the campaign, I would be completely mischievous to suggest that I was confident of victory, because the campaign really started late 2013 and went on for almost a year. And at that time, the opinion polls were not kind. I mean, I remember the social attitude survey in The Guardian and the opinion poll for Maury and the Scotsman, and they had support for independence around 25%.
Yeah, it was the late 20s, early 30s. I remember doing it in Modern Studies, talking about it. Yeah.
It was one poll had it at 23 and one had it at 25. I mean, that's how low support for independence was a year before the referendum, and that's very important that people remember these things, because although we lost the referendum, we actually won the campaign. I mean, you know, I know some people say it's sour grapes to suggest that, but the reality is we came from such a low base to get to 45%. That it was an incredible campaign. When I became convinced that we were going to win was probably in the last couple of months, around about August, September, because by this time I had the pleasure of addressing 121 meetings in every corner of Scotland, where every meeting was just standing room only. It was an incredible experience. And of course, a lot of my late meetings were in and around West Scotland. I remember one memorable meeting in Motherwell, where I was speaking at the Motherwell club next to the ground, the football park, and I had to do a meeting outside. I had to do a street meeting where I had to stand in the roof of a guy's car who allowed me to stand in the car, because there was too many people. It was an overspill meeting. There was too many people who couldn't get into the hall. Similarly in Dundee, we had the town hall booked, and we couldn't start the meeting right away because I had to go out and address a meeting in the steps of the town hall because there was no more room to get into the meeting. In Glasgow, we had a massive meeting in the Victoria's nightclub, and this venue held well over 500. We couldn't start the meeting because I had to go downstairs and address a meeting in the lower hall of several hundred who couldn't get into the meeting above us. So by this time, Jason, I'm convinced we're winning. I'm absolutely convinced we're winning this. Now, in retrospect, what I was picking up, particularly in the areas I've just mentioned, we did win in Dundee. We did win in North Lanarkshire. We did win in Glasgow. So what I was picking up was actually real vibes. It wasn't artificial. But what I didn't understand and what I hadn't put into the equation, particularly when you think of how strong a lot of SNP support is in the north of Scotland, I didn't understand why we lost it in the north of Scotland, why we lost it in Aberdeen, why we lost it in Edinburgh. And of course you then look at the reasons and you look at the breakdown, the demography of the vote, and you'll see that the working class, by and large, across Scotland, voted for independence. Young people, by and large, voted in large numbers for independence. The people who voted against were pensioners, and the well-off. Pensioners who I think were frightened. Lots of scare stories about your pensions wouldn't be safe, and there'll be a lot of instability. And the well-off, I think, were worried that an independent Scotland would be a left-of-centre Scotland and would tax them more, and that there would be more redistribution of wealth. I think the well-off thought, oh no, we can't have that. We'll have to pay higher taxes, and instead of 3 and 4 houses, we'll only have 1 or 2 houses. Instead of 4 or 5 cars, we'll maybe only have 2 cars. So I think greed played a part in a lot of the wealthy voting against independence, but that's just a sad reality of some of human nature, unfortunately. However, Jason, I said it on the night of the result, and I've said it ever since. It was a Pyrrhic victory for the Unionists. Pyrrhic, as in the major Greek general, where the term was coined from, who expended so many troops in winning a particular battle that he ended up losing the actual war. And from my point of view, the Unionists have lost the war. They've won the battle, but the Labour Party in particular have lost the war for the heart and soul of working class communities across Scotland. And I am absolutely convinced that when we get the next opportunity for a referendum, we're going to win it.
What makes you convinced that they're going to win it?
I think the fact that many of the promises that the Unionists made during the referendum, they said that Scotland would be booming with extra shipyard jobs. They said that the economy would recover and we would have more and more well-paid employment. They said that the country would be stable within the European Union. If Scotland voted for independence, it would mean leaving the European Union and lead to a loss of markets and economic power. All of these things have proved to be nothing more than falsehoods. The campaign that the Unionists fought under Operation Fear, that's exactly what they did. They tried to frighten people. They didn't win the arguments on economic terms or democratic terms. They won the argument by frightening people, by saying that the economy would collapse, that Scotland wasn't big enough, Scotland wasn't economically strong enough, Scotland wasn't clever enough. And of course, all of that is just garbage. We are big enough, we are economically strong enough, and we're certainly now, you can see from the isolation of the Brexiteers and the Boris Johnson and his crew, that we would be better off as an independent nation rather than be tied to Westminster. I recall one of the debates, Jason, in the midst of the campaign. I recall one of the independence campaigners, I can't remember who it was one of the TV debates, and they said, if Scotland votes to stay in the British Union, then before long you could end up with a right-wing Boris Johnson-led Tory government with Brexiteers demanding we leave Europe, and an economy that is a race to the bottom in terms of wages and conditions. And the unionists collectively, including the Tories on the platform, accused that speaker of scaremongering. Well, who's scaremongering now? That's exactly what we've ended up with, Jason. And I think the one-trick pony scare stories that were used during the 14 referendum won't be as effective the next time around. I also think it's very important that you bear in mind the generational factor, that the young people, not just 40, 50, 60%, but 70 and 80% of young people are in favour of independence. And those who weren't old enough to vote in 2014 will be old enough to vote the next time in 22 or 23, whenever we get it. And I think we're going to win handsomely. I don't think we'll win 50 or 51%. I think we'll win 60%.
Do you think there is a mandate for independence referendum number 2?
I don't just think there is. I believe it is staring us in the face. The SNP won the 2015 general election by a landslide. I mean, when people talk about you can't have another referendum unless there is fundamentally changed political conditions. Well, I was brought up in Glasgow. I was brought up in a Labour household. Scotland used to weigh the votes for Labour. I mean, let's remember, Scotland by 2014 had some 51 Labour MPs. By 2015, they had one. So that was a political earthquake, Jason. That was a change fundamentally in the political lexicon of Scotland politics. I mean, you as a teacher and others doing history and modern studies, you would have learned through many, many years about the domination of Scotland by the Labour Party. Well, it's gone and it won't return. And that is a fundamental change. They then had the 2016 Scottish elections where the SNP fought for a mandate to have an indirect 2 and won the election. You then had the Brexit debate, as you know, and the Brexit vote. 62% of Scotland voted to stay in the European Union. I'm no cheerleader for the European Union. I don't think the European Union is the bee's knees at all. I think it's a very undemocratic, pro-big business institution. But 62% of Scotland wanted to stay in it. And yet we've been dragged out of it. Then there was a 17 general election. The SNP won again. Then there was the 19 general election. SNP won again. There was then 2 votes in the Scottish Parliament on Indiref 2. And the Scottish Parliament voted twice to hold Indiref 2. Now, if that's not a mandate, Jason, what the hell is?
Yeah, well, they never actually name what the parameters would be for another one, but yet they're out there willy-nilly claiming that there isn't one.
If you examine the terms of the Northern Ireland Act of 98, Jason, it's quite instructive, because in the Northern Ireland Act of 98, it's there in black and white where they talk about the holding of a referendum on a united Ireland. And they say, without any fear of contradiction, they say that if after a referendum there is to be another one held, it must take place 7 years or more later. So it's written in black and white that as far as this political generation idea is concerned, 7 years is what's in the Northern Ireland Act. So if that's in the Northern Ireland Act, then why the hell is it not good enough for Scotland?
When do you think Indiref 2 will take place?
Well, I'm going to give you 2 answers. One is the hopeful answer, which is the SNP have said it will take place before the end of 23. So I hope they've not misled us on that, and I hope that's exactly what happens. But I've got my doubts now, Jason. I've got to say to you, I'm very, very worried that the SNP leadership now, I'm not sure that they are committed to an independence, never mind an independence referendum. The fact that they've not used any of the mandates that they had from 16, 17, 18, 19, they've not used any of them. They keep talking about they're going to ask Westminster if they can get a Section 30 agreement. Well, why the hell would Westminster agree to that? What Tory Prime Minister in his right mind would agree to a Section 30 at a time when the polls are neck and neck? It looks like 50-50. I mean, the only reason, we talked about this earlier, the only reason David Cameron agreed was because we were sitting at 25%. That's the only reason he agreed, because he thought they were going to win it by a landslide. There's no way a Tory PM is going to agree to a Section 30. So this nonsense that you're getting from the SNP leadership, it's illusory. It's a pipe dream. What we need the SNP to do is to grow some spinal cord and say, here is the date we are holding the next referendum. We are informing you, Westminster, that this is the reality, and it is going ahead on this date, and it will be an inclusive vote, and it will be a binding vote. Now, if Westminster then wants to take Scotland to court or whatever to try and challenge that in court, then let them do it. But for by goodness, why are we not forcing them to do that? Why are we standing idly by and letting these people ruin the lives of hundreds of thousands of people with their welfare cuts and their NHS cutbacks, their disgraceful attitude and operation of response to COVID? It's just pathetic and disgraceful.
I agree. I think my friends and I have had this same conversation before. I think it suits the SNP just to dangle the carrot rather than actually fulfil that electoral promise.
Well, there's no doubt in my mind that is definitely a reality right now. We have an SNP who, for years, I mean, it was formed as the Independence Party. Of course it was. And therefore you expect that it will prioritise the one cause on which it was born, independence. Problem is, it hasn't. It is now completely and utterly pushed independence off the agenda. You hardly hear them talking about it. There's certainly been no planning for it whatsoever. And I think the SNP had better look at what happened to Labour. Labour was riding high one moment and then was down in the doldrums the next, because they took their voters for granted. I think the SNP is heading for the same fall off that horse.
If SNP fall off that horse, is that where ALBA picks them up?
I think ALBA is an absolutely necessary organisation now. I obviously it will take a while for its credibility to grow, even people to know that it exists, because in the election that's just passed, the media did all it could to try and hide the existence of ALBA. However, that won't last forever. I attended the inaugural conference, 2-day conference of ALBA, and what was absolutely inspiring was the breadth and depth of former SNP activists who have now left the SNP and joined ALBA. I think the SNP's became an emptied out organisation, similar to what happened to New Labour. Very similar. I've seen it with my own eyes. In working class communities, the Labour Party became a party of councillors and the families. And I'm afraid that's what the SNP's becoming. It's becoming a party vote. People that are involved, people that are on the payroll, because it's certainly lost the oomph and the commitment to the cause that it once could rely on.
How does ALBA encapsulate your vision for an independent Scotland?
That's a good one, Jason. It's probably a good way to sort of a round off our discussion, because we started with me talking about being a socialist, and clearly ALBA is not a socialist party. There's no doubt about that. It's not a socialist party. And why am I in it if it's not a socialist party? Well, I'm in it because, in my opinion, in Scottish politics today, the priority fundamentally and the biggest issue is the constitutional question. I think independence is now going to dominate Scottish politics. It has done over this last 7 years, and it will do until we have our next referendum. And on that basis, it is imperative that we have a party that prioritises independence and says unequivocally that it is going to fight for independence and to deliver independence. Now, ALBA is not only doing that, but they have also adopted a set of policies, and they're there for everybody to examine. 20 different policies were adopted at the conference in Greenock, and they are clearly left of centre policies. Anti-poverty, pro-unilateral nuclear disarmament. This is a party that I am comfortable in. Yes, it's not socialist, I realise that, but it's left of centre, and there are many socialists in ALBA, and therefore I feel comfortable in that party.
Good. Just to round off then, a couple of wee quick questions about COP26 and the strike action that's going on surrounding that. But we'll start with COP itself. What do you think the legacy will be for Glasgow from COP26?
I don't think there'll be a legacy, Jason. I think COP's supposed to stand for Conference of Parties. It really should stand for Christmas early pantomime, because I just think it's a pantomime. I don't believe the world leaders who have arrived in Glasgow at great expense and hullabaloo and environmental cost. I don't believe their commitments. I don't believe they're sincere. I think if you look at the single biggest delegation, you'll find that the fossil fuel industry has got more lobbyists at that conference than any one country. These people are those who have been at the wheel while our planet has been burning. Why on earth do we think they're going to change direction now? I just don't trust them, Jason. So I don't think there'll be a lasting legacy. I think those who have attended to demonstrate deserve to be congratulated for raising the important issues, Extinction Rebellion and many of the other organisations, including the independence campaigns. But I've got nothing but utter contempt for the political leaders that are there.
Cleansing workers, the Glasgow City Council workers that are striking, do you stand in solidarity with them?
Absolutely. The cleansing workers, and before them the rail workers. Listen, strikes don't just happen out of the blue. People don't waking up one morning and decide, I'm going to go on strike today. Going on strike's a big decision, and it takes months and sometimes years of problems to build up to lead to strikes. So the cleansing strike in Glasgow didn't happen over the last couple of weeks. It's been bubbling away under the surface for many months in terms of wages and conditions and management treatment of these workers. So at the end of the day, politics to me is about taking sides. And I'm on the side of the workers. I'm on the side of the trade unionists. Sure, my bins haven't been collected. I've got my bins are overflowing. Yeah, I've got plastic bags all over my bins. It doesn't look good, but that's what happens. You can't make an omelette without breaking a bloody egg. So you can't have a strike without it inconveniencing people. See, if you're going to have strikes that don't inconvenience people, don't go on strike, because you'll never win anything. You need to inconvenience people, or else nobody will pay attention to your cause. So I support the cleansing workers. I certainly support, I think the rail workers are going to be forced to strike as well, and I support them.
And that's a wrap. A massive thank you to this week's guest for coming on to the show. I hope you all enjoyed listening as much as I enjoyed chatting. All of the relevant social media accounts can be found in the show notes. The usual bits and pieces from me to see you out. The best way to keep up to date with the latest goings on relating to Lost for Words is to follow using the handle @LostForWordsPod on both Twitter and Instagram. Send a message on either Twitter or Instagram if you have anything you'd like to ask a guest, or for a guest suggestion, or even just to leave any feedback. The best way to support the show is to hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, and if you use an Apple device, a 5-star review in the podcast app would be amazing. If you like what you hear, tell someone. Word of mouth also helps us to grow. Finally, to round off, all of your support and continued listening is genuinely appreciated. It means a lot to me to have you on this journey too. I am your host Jason, and I hope to have you back next week for another episode of the Lost for Words podcast.